Hello, everyone. I'm George from Ireland. This evening I'm going to talk about Bloody Sunday, not the 1972 one, but the 1921, because then centenary has just passed. So it's a significant and lugubrious event in Irish history. So going back to 1920, when there was a conflict raging in Ireland between the Irish Republican Army, IRA, which was a clandestine, irregular force, and they wanted to break the whole of the Ireland out of the United Kingdom and set up a republic with no political connection to our kith and kin in Great Britain. An overwhelmingly Catholic organisation. Some of them were anti-Protestants, some of them were not sectarian, and there were a couple of Protestants in the IRA. And on the other hand, there was the Crown Forces, that's say the British Army and the Royal Irish Constabulary, RIC. So the RIC were the police. But the RIC were mostly Irish, and actually the RIC was more disproportionately Catholic than the general population. Population, say 70% Catholic, the RIC about 80% Catholic. But quite a few RIC men have been killed by the IRA, others wounded, others retired, not enough volunteers to replace them, others resigned for fear of assassination, or because they didn't like the counterinsurgent role, because the IRA was fairly popular. Sinn Féin, meaning ourselves alone, that was its political party. So Sinn Féin and the IRA, they were largely synonymous. The Republican movement, we might call them. So there was an awful lot of political violence and then some apolitical criminality under the guise of an ideological cause. So this guerrilla conflict had been escalating. And in 1920, Michael Collins, he was the director of intelligence for the IRA, and he decided to, as he would see it, put out the eyes of British intelligence. So the Crown Forces, they tried to recruit informants. They want people inside the IRA, ideally, to tell them what's going on, and they had little success with that. But if they couldn't have that, they could have people on the fringes around who happened to report things that were useful. So Collins, he sent some of his people to approach the Dublin Metropolitan Police, DMP. The police in Dublin was different from the rest of Ireland, and to G Division, which was the intelligence department. So the Dublin Metropolitan Police was divided into various divisions. A, B, C, D, E, N, F were geographic ones. I think A, B, and C were various areas of Dublin north of the River Liffey. D, E, and F were various areas south of the River Liffey, and G was like a bit like criminal investigation department of an organised crime, including if it was politically actuated. These days we'd say terrorism, counter-terrorism, but in Ireland it's contentious, and most people hold the IRA of that time in high regard. So we could use a more neutral term, counterinsurgent. Anyway, so these faux informers that Michael Collins sent was simply to winkle out the G-men, and so they weren't all Irish. So it was the Cairo Gang, as they were informally called. So only from the late 20s, this term seems to have been retroactively applied to them. Various intelligence officers, mostly from Great Britain, former army officers coming over to Dublin on various spurious purposes, whatever I suppose their job was. There were plenty of English people in Dublin, so they didn't stick out a mile. But why is this man in his late 20s and his 30s got plenty of free time, quite a lot of money? What's he doing hanging around doing nothing in Dublin? So the tongues would wag. And so Collins was able to identify a lot of intelligence agents, both Irish and not, in Dublin. Some of them uniformed members of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, or indeed the RIC, some of them out of uniform to operate undercover. Their aim was to unmask the IRA, to arrest IRA men, to engage in firefights if necessary, to seize their mails. The IRA often communicating by letter for everybody had telephones, and telephones went by telephone operators, had to phone the operator to put you through on the wires. You've seen the old films. But the IRA was helped because a lot of the civilians were sympathetic to the IRA, passing on intelligence to them. Michael Collins' cousin, she worked in the post office, so she was privy to a lot of highly confidential security information which she was passing on. He said, how do these people get an empire at all? What, for not discriminating? We were discriminating against someone because of who her cousin was. That would be unfair, I suppose. That he thought obviously discriminating against people because their relatives was the right thing to do. Fair enough, it would have been a safer thing to do. And what were the other things? Well, the British Empire existed because we, the Irish, we built it to a large extent, along with the Welsh, Scots, and English. Anyway, so he identified roughly 20 Crown informers, so he thought, and decided he was going to kill them all in one fell swoop. So they scheduled it for Sunday. The Gaelic Athletic Association, GAA, founded in 1884, plays Gaelic games, as in Gaelic football or hurling. We just call it Gaelic. We'll just call it football, really, in Ireland. I mean, you might say soccer to distinguish between what the rest of the world calls football. Countries that say soccer are Ireland, Australia, and the United States. But it's all contextual, because in Ireland, if we say football, talking about what's happening in England, for instance, that's what most of the world calls football. But in Ireland, if we say football, we might well mean Gaelic. So the GAA, obviously a sporting organisation, quite popular, but it was part of the nationalist movement. If you look on the GAA's website, it says from 1887, it was taken over by the Irish Republican Brotherhood. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was a secret organisation. It's not the same as the IRA, but it overlapped with it. Smaller, more elite, of supposedly highly dedicated cadres. So the GAA said nobody who's been in the British Army or the RIC or draws a pension therefrom can ever be a member of it, and promote only Irish food and drink at their events, Irish dancing, Irish music. So there was xenophobic, indeed Anglophobic. Now, plenty of people in the GAA were there just for the sport, were not especially political. Others were more nationally minded. And some were Republicans, were openly pro-IRA. So I read sometimes in IRA sympathetic histories of this era, and there are plenty of them. There are none written from a unionist perspective that I know, say that the GA was banned, as games were banned at the time, which is clearly not true, because the GA was holding a game at Croke Park, tens of thousands of spectators. What an utterly flagrant lie as part of IRA propaganda. So for a century, the Crown Forces have been incessantly vilified. People try and build them up into absolute grotesques. So this monster ring has been quite effectual. If people do this non-stop for 100 years, yeah, it seeps into the national consciousness that a lot of people in the IRA think that they were absolute all scumbags, and that loads of people released from prisons, the worst fiends, to join the RIC. There was a unit of the RIC which was recruited exclusively from people outside of Ireland, the RIC Special Reserve, commonly called the Black and Tans, who got a very bad reputation in Ireland. I would argue largely undeserved, though there were crimes committed by members of the RIC Special Reserve, up to and including murder, though it was not a huge scale. There's also the Auxiliary Division, who were only former officers of the British Army who'd had field promotion. They hadn't been to Sandhurst. Just ordinary soldiers who served and showed their leadership qualities could be promoted without having had any special officer training. So anyway, the GA had a big game in Croke Park, which is the GA's national stadium in Dublin. It was it would kind of been the All Ireland final, because that's in September. But anyway, it was Dublin, so that's the local team, City and County Dublin. Obviously one of the best teams. It's got by far the highest population, bit of an advantage against Tipperary. So the people from Tip came up, and Collins, he planned killing these circa 20 intelligence officers for that day, because he said the streets will be full with tens of thousands of spectators, and as there's so many pedestrians, our men can blend into the crowd. Just stop in the crowd to stop and search people is just going to be impractical because of sheer numbers. So that's how we'll be able to give the Crown Forces a slip when their response swings into action to try to identify the culprits. So the squad was assembled. Some people call it the 12 Apostles, 12 IRA men very close to Michael Collins. One of them was Vinnie Byrne, who lived on into the 80s. You can see interviews with this soft-spoken chap who speaks in a strong Dublin brogue, and probably Sean Lemass, who was later the Taoiseach. So Sean Lemass, he's Irish but of distant French ancestry, hence the surname Lemass. Is Taylor, and he supposedly was on the edges of the Easter Rising, but let go because he's only 14. But though he was let off with his life, and no punishment whatsoever, he didn't show any gratitude for the mercy that was extended to him. You know, he's fighting outside uniform, and many people would say, you're outside the Geneva Convention, be executed. Now, I think because he's 14, you'd have to let him off from that. But he should have been grateful about the compassion that was shown to him. But oh no. So the IRA called the various addresses, and they shot dead lots of men. And I don't think they made any, they all managed to kill members of the Crown Forces, sometimes not the ones they were intending to. But they don't kill any civilians. They wounded the wife of one of the men they were trying to kill, not that badly. She recovered, and they got away. Sometimes they bumped into the police and shot them dead to effect their escape. Only one IRA man was wounded. So a highly successful strike from the IRA's perspective. And these men were almost all shot dead whilst unarmed. So the news reaches the ears of the RIC and indeed the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So there's consternation. They're obviously irate that 20 of their colleagues have just been killed and almost all unarmed. The thing is, because some of them were undercover, they sometimes weren't even known to the DMP or most of the RIC as police officers, just were Englishmen resident in Dublin were killed. So it would appear to some that civilians had been killed, even though it wasn't really the case. And this woman being wounded, the rumor may have got around she's rather more seriously wounded than she actually was, that she'd been killed. In fact, it wasn't that bad. Anyway, so they went to search Croke Park because they obviously figured out Collins's plan that yes, he had timed it partly because that was when there was a big GAA game, as in there were tens of thousands of visitors at the capital, and so the assassins could hide amongst the crowd, take the train back to Tipperary, not be noticed. There are just too many people to search. And because the GA's Republican associations, the RIC decided to search it. Anyway, so they go to Croke Park, and there's some ticket touts there ready to sell extra tickets. They see a lorry load of the RIC approaching. And these were not the ordinary RIC. They weren't Irishmen who'd been the RIC. They were the auxiliaries and the Special Reserve, commonly known opprobriously as the Black and Tans. So these guys were scarpered. Now, that appeared to the RIC to be lookouts. They were apparently not. I think there were people trying to sell tickets they weren't allowed to sell, so they didn't want to get nicked for that. So surrounding the stadium, they said they're going to search it for arms. But there are tens of thousands of people, and some people were standing, didn't have seats in those days. Now what happened next is disputed. The RIC claimed that people in the crowd opened fire on them. Now, I don't know of any spectator who supports that. Most people say that members of the RIC simply opened fire on the crowd, and in the end 14 people were killed, all by bullets, I think. I don't think anyone was killed in the stampede to get out of there. So 4 of them were IRA men who were killed, and 10 were civilians. We often hear it's all civilians killed. That's actually not true. Michael Hogan, I think it was the Tipperary footballer or goalkeeper, he was shot dead on the pitch. And he actually was an IRA man who'd been carrying messages back and forth for the IRA on the train. But that's not why he was killed, because the RIC man who shot him dead, I mean, I'm pretty sure he didn't know that Hogan was in the IRA, and he was killed unarmed. All right, in fairness, those RIC men had just been killed unarmed a few hours earlier. So it was almost a random killing or just rage. The public, it said that some members of the RIC had considered burning down O'Connell Street in reprisal for the slaying of their comrades. So there was uproar, people shrieking in terror and scarpering. They got out of there pretty quick because people were very frightened. Now, the RIC said they'd come to search the crowd for arms. It'd be quite difficult to stop them, cordon them, everybody leave one by one, pat them down. Some women, you know what's going to happen. They're going to put the gun on the woman on the basis that you can't pat down a woman or else that's molesting her. And I don't think there were any women in the RIC, which was a big oversight. But anyway, certainly firearms were recovered. I've heard as low as 1. I've heard up to 60 men who've got firearms just drop them. So when they walk out, they can't be found with one. So that was that. But there was at least one little boy who was amongst those who was killed. There was one young woman who was due to get married 5 days later, and indeed she was buried in her wedding dress. So obviously, and this was a real propaganda coup for the IRA. Is that what they wanted? I mean, presumably, cui bono, they would like to enrage the Crown Forces. They would like the Crown Forces to commit a crime against the populace, because then that'll drive a wedge between the Crown Forces and the public. Because you go back to before 1916, relations between the public and the RIC were quite good. They're widely accepted, often fairly high status people in remote villages. No particular aggro. They had to uphold law and order. To some extent, that's defending the state everywhere. But it's only then they're becoming unpopular. And the RIC found it very difficult to get people to volunteer outside of what's now Northern Ireland. And the RIC had to be mainly a counterinsurgency force, not carrying out ordinary policing duties like searching for lost children or catching pickpockets. The IRA set up their own police, but the IRA said, you come to us if you've got a problem. We'll identify suspects, arrest them, often beat them up, try and get a confession out of them. Some informal punishment, occasionally the IRA having their own prisons in remote areas of Cork, chaining people to church railings overnight, administering severe beatings to penalise people, getting people to disgorge their ill-gotten lucre, but had no way to take fingerprints to properly gather evidence, didn't have proper courts. The IRA did set up some sort of courts. They claimed that even unionists had received justice there. I'm not so sure if that's true. They didn't have properly barristers or solicitors, and obviously the judges will be sort of people who are pro-IRA, members of the IRA. So I don't think they could be seen as quite impartial. But the IRA said anyone who's a justice on by the Crown can't either. The IRA even killed a barrister who prosecuted people. So you couldn't have a fair trial according to them, because you've got to have two sides in a trial. They didn't kill defence barristers. So that is Bloody Sunday. So it's a day which should never be forgotten in Ireland, and it's a subject of much rancor to this day. There's much more recognition of those who were killed, looking at the individual stories of the victims, and memorials have been set up to them. So there's a Hogan stand in Croke Park, named in honour of the footballer who was shot dead that day. So Croke Park itself is named after the an Archbishop of, was it Tuam? I can't remember who helped found the GAA way back in 1884. Fairly nationalist organisation, still to this day the GAA. Only 20 years ago they dropped, I think it was Rule 10, which banned former members of the Crown Forces from, or serving members from being in it. And I think they used to be against garrison sports. You couldn't play football, hockey, tennis, anything that came from Great Britain. You had to play only GAA. So that's enough about Bloody Sunday in 1920, which is obviously a real propaganda coup for the IRA, both in killing quite a few of their enemies and in getting the Crown Forces to kill civilians. Now, it was the fault of the RIC men for killing those civilians, not the IRA. They should have shown greater discipline. Deliberately killing civilians is never acceptable. Yes, that is murder. And it was about 2007, I think, a football game was played there. Was even England allowed to play there, because usually it was only Gaelic games were permitted in Croke Park. It's still there in North Dublin, just by the Royal Canal, Russell Street, Leedsworth. That's where Brendan Behan was born, the celebrated wit and writer, raconteur and drinker. Unfortunately, the house he lived in doesn't stand anymore. All right, so that's enough about Bloody Sunday, 1920.